Hello everyone, so today we're going to talk about the first part of central nervous system, which is spinal cord. Next chapter is going to cover the brain. So spinal cord is how the information travels to the brain or from the brain. And the spinal cord also has the ability to integrate and process its own information and send out commands on its own. On this picture here, you can see there are series of sections through the spinal cord. So they cut these sections through the spinal cord, and if you compare these, you can right away see some of the differences. On this section, you can see there's L1, and this stands for lumbar. So this is a section through near the bottom of spinal cord where lumbar 1 vertebrae is. This one says S2, so it's referring to the sacral vertebrae. And if you notice, the spinal cord is extending from here. So this is where foramen magnum is. This is the biggest hole that you see on the skull. That's foramen magnum to the inferior border of the first lumbar vertebrae. So it comes up to here, and then you have some nerves going down. Now on these sections, you can see white part and you can see gray part. So the spinal cord contains bundles of axons that are found throughout. This gray matter is the location for the neuron cell bodies. This is where the collection of neuron cell bodies is within the CNS, in this gray matter. And then it's surrounded by this white part, which is known as white matter. So we have gray matter, looks like a butterfly or letter H, and then around it we have the white matter. White matter is, it looks white because that's where myelinated nerve fibers are. So those look white. So again, gray matter is composed of the cell bodies of neurons, and it's unmyelinated neuron processes. And then the white matter is myelinated neuroprocesses or nerve fibers. Another thing I want you to notice when looking here, the spinal cord is enlarging a little bit right here, and then it's enlarging a little bit right here. So this cervical enlargement is supplying nerves to the upper limbs, so the arms, and then the lumbar enlargement is supplying to the lower limbs. So this is where it's going to pectoral girdle and the upper limbs, and this is where it's going to the pelvis and the lower limbs. Another thing that you can see here is the posterior median sulcus. Posterior towards the back, median it's in the middle, sulcus it's a groove. So you can see this on this section that's been cut. So you can see posterior median sulcus here. So we covered cervical enlargement, posterior median sulcus, lumbar enlargement, that's where it's going to pelvis and lower limbs. Then we have a few more terms. This is called conus medullaris, and this is located at L1 vertebrae. So this is where you have lumbar first vertebrae. That's where you have conus medullaris. And that's because I said earlier that the spinal cord extends from foramen magnum to L1. So when it comes down here, it tapers. So spinal cord tapers, and it's going to form a cone-shaped tip, and that's called conus medullaris. So spinal cord ends here, but you still have some nerves going down, and they're continuing up to here, and then they terminate, and that's called filum terminale. And then this structure here reminded the anatomist of horsetail. Cauda is tail, quana is horse, so this is called cauda quana. And then on this side showing that there are 8 cervical spinal nerves, 12 thoracic, same as the number of vertebrae, 5 lumbar, same as the number of vertebrae, and then 5 sacral. There is 8 cervical, but there's only 7 cervical vertebrae, and the reason for that is because the first pair of spinal nerves coming off between the skull and the first cervical vertebrae. And the names for the spinal nerves comes from the vertebrae that's inferior to them. So the first nerve takes the name of C1, and then it continues. So cervical nerve C2 is going to exit from the vertebral column that's superior to C2. So the cone shape is conus medullaris at L1, filum terminale, where it's going to terminate. So again, this is a cross section through the vertebrae. And if you remember, when you learned about vertebrae, this part was called spinous process, and it's posterior. So this is what you can feel on your back. So this is posterior or dorsal. So that's your back side. Then we have body of the vertebrae here. And this is going to be on the anterior or ventral side. So we have posterior here, where it's sticking out, and then the ventral where the body is. Then we have the vertebral foramen, and that's where we have the spinal cord. And it's going to have a gray matter and white matter. White matter is the myelinated neuron are, and This is where the cell bodies are. And we have the gray matter looking like a letter H or butterfly and surrounded by white matter. So the protection for the spinal cord, we can see one is bone, surrounded by bone. In addition to that, there are meninges. So these are three layers, three meninges. Between those meninges, there is space. It's called subarachnoid space. And that's where the cerebrospinal fluid is in there. So I'm going to show you this on next slide, all the meninges and the CSF. On this picture, you can see the posterior median sulcus. So that's the one I showed you on last slide. You have these roots, dorsal and ventral. So this is called dorsal root because it's on the dorsal side, and then you have the ventral root on the ventral side. Once they come together, they meet here. It's called spinal nerve. So they come together to make the spinal nerve. On this picture, you can see the dorsal roots here because we're looking at it from the back. There's something called dorsal root ganglion, and that's when the cell body is found on the outside of CNS. That's called ganglion. We'll talk more about it once we get there. Okay, so brain and spinal cord, they're surrounded by three meninges. The outermost layer is called dura mater, or tough mother, and then there is the arachnoid in the middle, looks like spider web. Pia mater is the innermost layer, so known as soft mother. And there is cerebrospinal fluid that's going to circulate through the subarachnoid space. So let's look at that. So we have the spinous process body, and then we have the ventral root here on the anterior side, and we have the dorsal root here. And then when we look at the layers, we said the outermost is dura mater. So this is the outermost layer that's surrounding it. So we have bone, then we have some adipose tissue, and then we have this dura mater. And then we have arachnoid. So that's arachnoid. It's going to have some of this spider web appearance. So that's arachnoid. And then sub means under. So there is this subarachnoid space after the arachnoid layer. And in this space, that's where the cerebrospinal fluid is circulating. So this space has cerebrospinal fluid and the dark space there. And then the innermost layer is the pia mater. It's right around the spinal cord, touching the spinal cord. And here, since we have the dura mater and there's some space there, that's called subdural space. Subdural space there. To review it one more time, how is it protected? We have the bone, then we have some adipose, then we have the dura mater, subdural space, arachnoid matter, subarachnoid space with cerebrospinal fluid, and then we have the pia mater around the spinal cord. Cerebrospinal fluid is going to be a shock absorber, and it's going to be a diffusion medium for the diffused gas and nutrients and chemical messengers or ions to circulate. However, the subdural space, you can see it in cadavers, but you can't see it in a living person. So this is the posterior view of the spinal cord. It's showing the meningeal layers, pia mater, arachnoid, and dura mater. You're gonna have under the arachnoid subdural space with the cerebrospinal fluid. And it also showing you the distribution of the gray matter and white matter. So you have this H-shaped gray matter, then you have the white matter around it. You have the ventral root, because we know this is the spinous process on the posterior side, and then the dorsal root. They come together to make the spinal nerve here. And then you have this bulge. This is what I mentioned in the previous picture. You have this bulge, and it's on the dorsal side. So this is the dorsal side, and this is the location for some visceral sensory cell bodies, and this is called ganglion because it's lying outside of the central nervous system. Now, spinal cord is part of your central nervous system, but these nerves are on outside, and if it has a bulge, that's going to be called ganglion because that's where the cell body is for some of the neurons. Looking on this picture, this is the sectional view. That's what we saw on the previous slide. So you have the meninges. You can also see some fat, some adipose tissue there. Another thing I want you to notice is this geniculate ligament. It's coming off of this pia mater, and that's what you can see here as well. So you can see these geniculate ligaments that are coming off of the pia mater. So you have the pia mater there, and then you have the geniculate ligaments. If you were to dissect the spinal cord in class, you'll be able to see these, and then you would have to label these. So on this picture, let's just focus on the gray matter first. And we said again, gray matter is collection of neuron cell bodies within the CNS. This slide says posterior horns. They are sensory. So sensory nerve fibers are going to enter the spinal cord through the posterior horns. So what we have here is the gray matter. And then you have the anterior median fissure and posterior median sulcus. And this is on the posterior side. This is on the anterior side. On this side is where you would have the spinous process. Now, since we know this is a posterior side, this gray matter, it's going to have a posterior horn. So this is the posterior horn located on the posterior side. And then the opposite side have the anterior horn. In the middle, we have the lateral horn. And this is only found in the thoracic and lumbar areas, the lateral horn. So we have posterior, lateral, and anterior. So what this is saying, the sensory nerves, they're going to come in through the dorsal root ganglion, which is right here. So this is the dorsal root, and this is where the cell body is going to be for those sensory nerves. And it's going to enter the spinal cord, and it's going to pass through the dorsal roots into dorsal horns, which means that the nerves are coming through the dorsal root. The cell body is going to be in the dorsal root ganglion. It's going to enter the dorsal root into the dorsal horn, and then there it can either connect with another neuron or a command can be sent out, which we will look at later. So gray matter, we said that it has cell bodies, and it can have a little bit of myelin or no myelin, and it's going to have 3 horns: posterior, lateral, and anterior. We already talked about the posterior horn. We said the sensory nerve fibers, they can come through the dorsal root, and the cell body is going to be in dorsal root ganglion. It's going to come through the posterior horn. Now in the anterior horn, it's going to have motor nerve impulses leaving through the ventral roots. We said sensory is here. Sensory nerve impulses are coming in. So sensory information is coming into the posterior horn. Commands or the motor nerve impulses is leaving through the ventral. So sensory and motor. Posterior is going to have sensory information coming in, so the input. Ventral is going to be the motor, that's information leaving the output. Motor nerve impulses leave through the ventral or the anterior roots. And then I said the lateral horn, which is found only in thoracic and lumbar sections, it's going to be responsible for the autonomic nervous system, and that's the parasympathetic and sympathetic division. So it's responsible for the involuntary actions. And then we have one more thing. We have the commissure. So there is the gray commissure, and then there is the white commissure. What commissure is, it refers to the bundle of nerve fibers that cross from the right side of the CNS to the left side of the CNS. So this is where they're connecting 2 halves of the CNS together, and it's going to allow communication between the 2 halves of the nervous system. So this is where the information from the right side is crossing to the left side, or from the left side is crossing to the right side, is connecting these 2 halves. So that's known as commissure. And the word we have for crossing, information is called decussation. Gray commissure is the area where the information is crossing or decussating, and then the white is found in the white matter, and that's where also the information is crossing over. Now on this white matter, you have these tracts. So those tracts are the regions. So there are different regions that are responsible for sensory, and they're responsible for motor. So ascending is known as sensory, and then the descending is known as motor. So I'm going to show you this next. White matter, it's going to be divided into these columns, and these columns are going to be responsible for different type of information. So we have dorsal or posterior column, that's going to be on the posterior side. Ventral, it's going to be on the ventral side, and then the lateral on the lateral side. So for the gray matter, we had the horns: posterior horn, lateral horn, anterior horn. For the white matter, we have columns: posterior column, ventral column, and then the lateral column. Anterior column is going to be associated with motor. So same thing as the anterior horn, that's associated with motor. So this is associated with motor. Posterior is associated with sensory. And then the lateral depends on the exact location. So it depends where it's at, if it's in the thoracic area or the lumbar area. Okay, so let's look at the histology and do the overview of the spinal cord. So when we look at it first, we can notice right away the gray matter, looks like H, and then the white matter here. Gray matter is going to have the cell bodies, and then the white matter is going to have myelinated axons, the nerves. And then we have dorsal root. We have dorsal root on both sides. We also have the ventral root on both sides. These dorsal root and ventral root come together to make the spinal nerve. So spinal nerve is going to contain both sensory and motor nerves. And then on this dorsal root, there's this bulge. That's where the cell body is for the sensory. And that's called the dorsal root ganglion because the cell body is outside of the CNS. Let's focus our attention on the gray matter now. So this area here, it's on the posterior side. It's called posterior horn. This area that's on the anterior side is called anterior horn. In the middle, if you're in the thoracic or lumbar area, you're going to have lateral horn as well. In the gray matter, in the very center, we have this hole, and that's called central canal. It's going to extend through the entire length of the spinal cord, and this is where the CSF or the cerebrospinal fluid is going to flow or circulate. It's gonna come out at very end, bottom of the spinal cord. And then on both sides, in the white matter, you can see the posterior median sulcus on the posterior side, and then the anterior median fissure on the anterior side. Another thing you have is the commissure. So on this picture, the area that's above the central canal is posterior gray commissure. Below it is the anterior gray commissure. And again, this is where the nerve fibers are decussating or crossing from left to right or right to left. So this is where the information is crossing. So that's what's being shown on this picture, and you should be able to see this under the microscope. And I will be giving you a slide where you can look at this under the microscope. Okay, since we already labeled the spinal cord, now let's look at the information in it. So inside the spinal nerve, we said there's both sensory neurons sending information to the CNS and motor nerve fibers sending commands to the effectors of the body. And then we said the sensory information is coming through the dorsal root branch, and then the motor information is going out through the ventral root branch. And then they join together to make the spinal nerve here. So this part, it's called dorsal gray horn. And this is going to have semantic and visceral information, so sensory information for both. So semantic information coming from your skin, your muscles, and then the visceral information coming from the internal organs. So this is where the information is going to come in. Anterior gray horn, that's going to have the motor commands going out through the ventral root. So that's going to have the semantic, and then the lateral area we have the visceral, which is under the control of autonomic nervous system. So that's where the information is going out. So we looked at this picture. This is the histology. We labeled everything. And we looked at this picture which said that the dorsal root is where the sensory information comes in, the ventral where the motor information or motor commands go out to the effectors of the body. Now we have this picture. This is showing the organization within the spinal cord for each part of the body. It's not showing everything, but this is just showing you an example. So we have the white matter here, and then we know that white matter has a posterior column, lateral column, and the anterior column. In the posterior white column, there's an area that's responsible for sensory tracts. Sensory is the information that comes in, and this is showing you an example of the area that's responsible for each part of the body. And then in the anterior gray horn, you have motor nuclei that's going to send the commands out. So the purpose of this picture is to show you that both sensory and motor components of the spinal cord have a definite regional organization. They have their own regions that are going to be responsible for a specific part of the body. Okay, so what's inside the spinal cord? So if you remember my last lecture, I said there's the 4 types of neurons. There's 2 types of sensory, and there's 2 types of motor neurons. So there's semantic sensory and there's visceral sensory, and there is semantic motor and there was autonomic motor neurons. So semantic sensory is going to bring information from the skin to the CNS, and visceral is going to bring information from the visceral or the internal organs to CNS. So let's look at one example. So here we have a neuron. it says that semantic sensory information from the right side of body. So it's bringing some information, let's say from the right side of the body, passes through the dorsal root. There's the cell body in the dorsal root ganglion, and it's going to enter the posterior gray horn. Now it enters there, and it's going to deliver the sensation to the CNS or the spinal cord. Now, once it enters the spinal cord, it's going to synapse with another neuron. So you can see this is a neuron that's sending signal to higher levels. It's going up. It's taking the information upper level of the spinal cord, and it's communicating with the upper level. So you can see synapsing with another neuron. Now this neuron, it's synapsing with this neuron, and it's crossing over, so it's decussating, and it's going up to the thalamus. This neuron that's located completely in the CNS or central nervous system is known as interneuron, if you remember from my last lecture. So it's going to take the information to the brain, and the part of the brain it's going to take the information is called thalamus. So this one here, the one that's bringing information is the first order neuron. Then it's going to synapse on an interneuron, that's the second order neuron. It's going to cross over and go to the thalamus. Now this third level or third order neuron, it's going to take the information, sensory information from the thalamus to the higher levels of the brain, depending on wherever it needs to go. And this is known as spinal thalamic tract. So it's taking information from the spinal cord to the thalamus of the brain, and then it can be sent to the higher levels where thinking occurs or where the consciousness is. So let's say, for example, you tap on someone's knee, and that's going to cause the leg to move. So when you tap on someone's skin or the knee, it's going to activate the semantic sensory neuron. So it's going to activate this neuron that's going to take the information in, and it's going to release the action potential that's going to activate the interneurons. That's going to activate this interneuron, and then that's going to send action potential that's going to be sent out to the thalamus or the higher level. And on this bottom picture, this is showing you the arrangement of sensory tracts. So specific information is carried by a specific tract. So let's say information that's dealing with pain will be carried within a different sensory tract versus information dealing with touch. So this is showing you the sensory fibers carrying information for touch and pressure. This one is for pain, and then here we have the crude touch. So there are different regions for different type of information, different tracks for different type of information that's traveling in the spinal cord. And then this is showing that as you move up on the spinal cord, so as you're moving superiorly on the spinal cord, the information is going to be traveling from medial to lateral side. So the information at the inferior levels of the spinal cord is going to be more medial, versus information that's at a more superior level is going to be more lateral. So for example, sensory nerve that's entering at T11, so thoracic 11, it's going to be located more medial versus the information that's going at a C4, so cervical 4. It's going to be more lateral. And then another thing is whenever the sensory nerves are entering the spinal cord, they can be grouped together. So for example, sensory fibers that are coming from the region of the upper limb, they form a tract containing organized bundles of the nerve fibers that are coming from the hand, wrist, or forearm and arm. So they can be organized in bundles. So when sensory information comes in, the motor commands has to be sent out. So the central nervous system is going to send motor commands in response to the sensory information that came in. And these commands are going to be sent out by a semantic nervous system, so semantic division of motor nervous system, motor tracts, and then the autonomic nervous system. The semantic nervous system is going to send semantic motor commands that are going to go to skeletal muscles, and then autonomic, also known as visceral motor system, is going to be sending the commands to the visceral or the internal organs, such as smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and the glands. So this is going to involve two motor neurons. So there's the upper motor neuron, and then there is the lower motor neuron. So the upper motor neuron can excite or send action potential to lower motor neuron, and then the lower motor neuron is going to relay that motor command to the skeletal muscle fibers. So this neuron that's located completely in the CNS is known as interneuron. So that's the upper motor neuron. It's going to excite the lower motor neuron, and that's going to send command to the skeletal muscles. And same thing as sensory and descending tracts, you have different motor tracts that are going to be responsible for different type of commands and information that's being sent out. So For example, we have rubrospinal tract that's going to adjust your upper limb position and the muscle tone during voluntary movements. And this information, this motor commands can be conscious or subconscious, so you don't really think about it, and sometimes you're aware of it. So again, because it's covering both the semantic motor neurons and the autonomic, so autonomic is automatic. So you don't really have to think about it. And then we have the reticulospinal tract that's going to originate in the reticular formation center. So we're going to talk about it when we talk about the brain. And then there is the tectospinal and then the vestibulospinal tract. So again, these tracts are responsible for different type of information that's being sent out. So descending is being sent out. So just to remind you, there are 31 pairs of the spinal nerves that are coming off on both sides. Cervical is going to be 1 through 8. So the first one is going to come off between the skull and the first cervical vertebrae. Thoracic, same as the number of vertebrae, 12. Lumbar, again, same as the number of vertebrae, 5. Sacral 5 and coccygeal 1. So we have 8, 12, 5, sacral 5, and then the coccygeal 1. So we have a total of 31 pairs. The spinal nerves are coming off on both sides of the vertebral column. And this picture is color coded to show you where they're coming off. You can see it's first one is coming off superior to the first cervical vertebrae, and then we have the second, and then the third. So you can kind of see the location of each, and this is where the spinal cord ends. So at L1, so when they do the spinal tap, they usually do it below, and these nerves kind of move out of the way, and that's how they take the sample of the cerebrospinal fluid if they needed to. And then you can see the nerves, they're going down, extending down, and then they terminate. So the filum terminale is going to be right here. Actually, you can see it on this picture. So the yellow. So this is color coded, same as this picture. So what we have on this picture is that you can see the gray matter and then a white matter that's surrounding it. And there is this dorsal root that's coming off the posterior side of the spinal cord. And then this is the ventral or the anterior root. Where they come together, that's where you have the spinal nerve. 4 types of nerve fibers make the spinal nerve. And those 4 types are the sensory, so somatic sensory, and then the visceral sensory. You have the semantic motor neuron and the autonomic motor neuron that's coming off of the anterior side. And all those 4 together, they make the spinal nerve. Those spinal nerves are leaving through the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus. What you're going to notice that this nerve is crossing over here, and it's going to go out through the ventral ramus, and then same thing is happening right here. So what's going on is that if you look at just the dorsal ramus, it's made up of 2 nerves. One is sensory from the specific part of the skin of the back. So sensory information from the skin or the back is going towards the spinal cord, and another nerve is the motor here. So motor is taking commands to the skin in the back that's going through the ventral root and then through the dorsal ramus. So this is going to cross over. So in this dorsal ramus, you have a sensory that's going to bring information in, and then you have a motor that's taking the commands out. And then we also have the ventral ramus here. So what we have for the ventral ramus is the sensory information from ventrolateral body surfaces and structures of body wall and limbs. So your limbs, your body wall, the information is going to be coming in, and that goes towards the dorsal root. So this one is crossing over, going towards the dorsal root. And then it's also sending motor signals to skeletal muscles. So the signals that are going out, those are going to the muscles of the body and the wall. And then you have white ramus and gray ramus. This is gonna come in play when the autonomic nervous system neurons has to go out to the visceral organs, so the heart or gallbladder, so anything that's under autonomic control, and you'll see this in thoracic and lumbar areas. So if I were to give you an overview of what's going on here, so let's start here. Dorsal root is going to bring information in. So this is another picture. It's just showing you the same thing, but it's labeled for you. So right here, we know we have the gray matter, there's the white matter. In the posterior part of the gray matter, sensory information comes in, the input comes in. Anterior part of the gray matter is going to send motor commands out. What's connecting to the posterior gray horn is the dorsal root. That's what the information is coming in through. So sensory information is going to enter the dorsal root, and the cell body is going to be in the dorsal root ganglion, and it's going to continue and bring information into the posterior gray horn. The information is received. Now you can have another neuron that's going to be connected with this neuron and then to the motor neurons. And that's going to be known as interneuron. And then you have information output going. So first you're going to receive information, you're going to receive input signal, then your body's going to be sending the output. It's going to be sending the commands. The commands that are going out, they can go out to the internal or the visceral organs, or they can go out to the muscles. So you have this part that's going out, and it's gonna go out to the skeletal muscles of the body. And dorsal ramus is going to take that command to muscles of the back, and the ventral ramus is going to be taking the muscles of the body, wall, and limbs. So this is going to separate the signal into two parts. One is going towards the back, the other one's going towards the limbs. And then another thing you have here is the white ramus and gray ramus, and if you follow this back, it's going right here, and this is where you have the visceral motor. So this is the signal that's going to the internal organs, such as your heart or other visceral organs. And this part has to do with the autonomic nervous system, so that's under sympathetic and parasympathetic controls. So we're going to talk a lot more about it when we get to the autonomic nervous system chapter. The reason there's white ramus and gray ramus, this is going to be myelinated, and it's going to give it to that white appearance, and the cell body is going to be here, so this is called gray ramus. This is showing you the information coming in. So actually, if you were to look at it, the information has to come in first, and then the commands are going to go out. So what we have here, we have the dorsal root ganglion that's going to have cell bodies. Now this is the information coming in from the exteroreceptors, proprioceptors, so your pain receptors, touch receptors. This is information coming in from your visceral organs. Now from the interoceptors at the back, and then this is from the body, wall, and limbs. So that's going to come through ventral ramus. Ventral means front. It's going to bring signals in from the front of the body. Dorsal is going to bring signals in from the back of the body. So the information comes in from the back of the body, from the front of the body, and from the limbs, and it's going to enter the dorsal root, and this is where the cell body is going to lie, and it's going to come in through the dorsal gray horn or posterior gray horn, and it's going to bring semantic sensory information, so from the receptors, external receptors, and visceral sensory information from the internal visceral organs. And then your body's going to decide what commands needs to be sent out. Now if this information was to cross over on a different level, so if it was to go up the spinal cord, then it's going to be second level neuron that's going to be taking it up to the spinal cord. That's going to be known as interneuron because it's completely inside the CNS. And then it can send it to the thalamus of the brain. From the thalamus of the brain, third level neuron can send it to the higher levels of the brain where the thinking is done. Let's say somebody taps on your knee. Now that's going to send semantic sensory neuron from the limbs. That's going to send semantic sensory neuron here, and it's gonna go through the dorsal root, and it's gonna go to the dorsal gray horn. So this is going to activate action potential. It's gonna activate, someone tapping on your knee is going to activate action potential. That's gonna send information to the dorsal gray horn. Now that's the first level neuron that's bringing the information in. Now that information, it can go up to your brain through the interneuron, so second level neuron. It can go up to your brain in the thalamus through the second level neuron. Now the second level neuron is going to be called interneuron because it's completely inside the CNS. From the thalamus of the brain, there's a third level neuron that can take the information to the higher levels of the brain. And that's when you decide if someone tapped on your knee or if someone touched your knee, if you felt that or not, if that requires thinking. So once the information goes to the higher levels, then you can feel that touch. So if someone, touched your knee or if someone tapped your knee. Now, when someone taps your knee moves. Now that command is coming out through the motor area. It's going to either snaps to an interneuron. It's going to cross over, take the information to the brain. But there's also going to be another neuron here that's going to take the command down. And that's going to cause the knee to move. Now if there's an injury of the spinal cord, the knee can still move because the information is coming in and it's going to snap with another neuron here that's going to take the command out. But the information is not going to be able to travel up to the brain if there is, let's say, injury in the C7 area to the thalamus. That way your knee is still going to move, but you won't be able to tell the touch. So you won't be able to tell someone touched the knee, but your knee still be moving because there was injury in the interneurons that were taking that information up to the thalamus. This is showing the posterior view of the spinal nerve. So as we talked about, you have 8 cervical nerves, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. And then you have different plexuses. So there are a few that you have to know. Plexus is a network formed from nerve fibers of a different spinal cord. So it's a group of nerve fibers. You have cervical plexus, brachial plexus, and lumbar plexus, and then the sacral plexus. Also, sometimes lumbar and sacral plexus combine together, lumbosacral plexus. So there are some nerves that you have to know for each plexus. So cervical plexus, it's going to include the phrenic nerve that's going to go to the diaphragm, and it's going to be sensory and motor. Sensory is going to bring information from the diaphragm muscle. Motor is going to take the commands out to the diaphragm muscle. And this muscle is responsible for breathing. Okay, so there are a few nerves that you have to know for the brachial plexus. So the first time you look at brachial plexus, sometimes it can get a little bit hard to understand, but if you draw this 3 to 4 times, you should be able to understand what's going on. So first we have these nerves that are coming off of the cervical area that's going to go to the arm. These are the nerves that you guys have to know. And these are color coded. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to start right here and I'm going to follow it down, and we're going to follow these nerves. So first thing I'm going to tell you is that the root of the brachial plexus originates from the ventral rami from C5 to T1. So C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1 is making the brachial plexus. Spinal nerves are coming off of these areas for the brachial plexus. Next thing you're going to notice, C5 is going to combine with C6 here. C7 doesn't combine, it just continues here, up to here. And then C8 combines with T1. So we have nerves coming off from C5 to T1. Some of these combine, some of them don't. The one that combines C5 and C6, that's called upper trunk. C7 continues, known as middle trunk. C8 combines with T1, known as lower trunk. So far we know that the brachial plexus is formed by C5 through T1, and the ones that combine C5, C6 making upper, C7 making middle, and C8 and T1 making lower trunk. If we keep following these trunks, it's going to divide in anterior and posterior division. It's labeled here that this is the posterior division. So if these green ones are posterior divisions, then we have these top ones that are anterior divisions. So this is anterior, and then this is anterior division. So you have those color-coded. Green are posterior divisions, and then the yellow are anterior divisions. And that's important because some of these posterior divisions are going to combine to make some of these nerves. So let's follow these divisions. So here we have the posterior division of the middle trunk and the superior trunk combining, and that's gonna make the lateral cord. Then we have all 3 posterior divisions combining, and that's making the posterior cord. Medial cord is made of continuation of the anterior division of the inferior trunk. So we have the inferior trunk continues making the medial cord. So if we have lateral cord, posterior, made up of all the posterior divisions, and then the medial cord is just a continuation of the inferior trunk. Okay, now we are on the last part, which are these nerves. Now, first one I'm going to show you is the musculocutaneous. So I'm going to start from, so if you follow this lateral cord, one of these nerves is going to become the musculocutaneous. So it's going to bifurcate, and one of them is called the musculocutaneous. And when you follow the other one, you're going to notice it's going to combine. It's going to combine with the lateral cord, and it's going to form the median nerve. So we have musculocutaneous that comes off of the lateral cord, and then lateral cord combines with the medial cord. That's going to make the median nerve here. And then we have 3 more. And then if we continue, ulnar nerve that's coming out of the other branch of the medial cord. And then we have 2 left, axillary and radius. And if we look at this posterior cord, one of them is going to branch out, that's axillary, and then the other one continues down, that's radial. Give you an overview here of the nerves. You have musculocutaneous, that's made up of the lateral cord. So lateral cord is going to bifurcate. One is musculocutaneous, other one combines with the medial cord, and it's going to make the median nerve. And the other branch of the medial is going to become the ulnar. And then the posterior is going to make the axillary, and then the radial here. So what I did, I found this figure is showing you from C5 to T1 and how they're combining to make each cord. So what I recommend doing, have your book open at the same time and try to trace this down and try to learn which ones are combining together to make each of these nerves. This is the only plexus that I'm asking you to go in detail. I'm not going to cover other plexuses in detail. So lumbar plexus, one of the nerves that comes off of lumbar plexus that you know is the femoral nerve. Sciatic nerve and sciatic, tibial, and fibular nerves are going to come off of the sacral plexus. So this is the sciatic nerve. If you look on this figure, you can see the cervical plexus and all these nerves that are part of the cervical plexus. I'm not asking you to know these except the phrenic nerve. For brachial plexus, you have to know all these nerves. And then the lumbar plexus, it's going to make one of them that you know is the femoral nerve, and then the obturator nerve, also part of your lab report. So make sure you know femoral and obturator nerve. And then you also have the sacral plexus that's going to make the sciatic nerve, which is a really famous one. So this picture is showing dermatomes, and the dermatomes are specific regions of the body surface that's going to be associated with spinal nerves. So let's say you lose sensation in your finger, in your index finger, and this is going to be associated with the spinal nerve, that's C7. So that's found in C7 area. Now it's really difficult for them to pinpoint exactly, but this gives the doctors an idea where's the issue if there's loss of sensation in this area that's associated with C8. So dermatomes are going to show the regions of the body that are associated with a specific spinal nerves. And then they note down the nerve that's related to each dermatome. So anytime there's an issue, they can go back here and they can kind of see which one is having an effect on the sensation. This side is showing the anterior, this is showing the posterior part of the body. So let's talk about reflexes. Reflexes, immediate involuntary response to the stimulus. So if I throw a ball on you, you're going to duck even before your brain has a chance to do that, because your spinal cord is responding, so you're going to duck even before you know it. And then we have reflex arc that's going to explain the neural pathway of the particular reflex. So there are steps that the reflexes has to go through, or the signal has to go through for you to give that response to me throwing a ball at you. So let's look at that. So there are 5 steps. The first one is stimulation and activation of the receptor. So let's say you step on a nail. That's the stimulus. It's going to send a signal, sensory signal, through the dorsal root into the posterior gray horn. So the sensory neuron is synapsing with another neuron, and that neuron is bifurcating. One part is crossing over, decussating, and going up to the brain. And then this part is continuing and synapsing with a motor neuron that's going to send response to the muscle, maybe asking the muscle to step away from the nail. So the third step, it's going to process the information. Then the fourth is activation of the motor neuron, and then the response is the last step. That's when it's asking you to move your hand away or move your foot away. That's the response. Now, this is what I was talking about. I said if there is an injury of the spinal cord at a certain level, let's say right now we're looking at maybe T1 level. If there is an injury at C6, the information is only going to be travel up to C6. The information is not going to be able to cross C6 and get up to the brain. And then on here showing the red is representing sensory neuron. And this is the excitatory interneuron, because it's completely located in the spinal cord. That's bifurcating, going to the synapsing in another motor neuron and also going up to the brain. So what we just looked at is polysynaptic. We had an interneuron that was bifurcating, going up to the brain and also to the motor neuron. So in this case, it's responding by moving the muscle. And also maybe, if you stepped on a nail, it's going to include the response from the brain, maybe, other maneuvers that you have to do from keep yourself from falling. So that's going to be involving the brain and the higher centers Monosynaptic is only one synapse. Spinal reflexes they're processed in the spinal cord, so sometimes the information doesn't have to travel up to the brain. Cranial reflex is going to be processed in the brain. And then the development of the reflexes, it's innate, means it's genetically determined and acquired, that you learn over your lifetime. Semantic reflexes, this is going to be controlling skeletal muscle contractions, superficial and stretchy receptors. Autonomic is going to be actions of smooth muscle and cardiac muscles, your heart, glands, and adipose tissue. So there are different kinds of reflexes. So you can define these by development, response, complexity of circuit, if it only requires this spinal cord response, or it also requires thinking by your brain, and then the processing side where it's going to be processed. These are the steps of the stretch reflex. So stimulus is going to send action potential of a stretch of a muscle. It's going to activate sensory neuron that's going to go to the dorsal gray horn, take the information in. Information is processed at the spinal cord, which is part of your CNS. And motor neurons are activated, and it's going to take that command out. So action potential is sent down, and it's going to cause the muscle to contract. So there are 5 steps. This is showing you those 5 steps, and this is an example of monosynaptic. You don't have an interneuron here that's going up to the brain. So you have a stimulus of stretching a muscle that's going to send action potential down dorsal root into the posterior gray horn. That's going to synapse to another motor neuron, process the information here, and send the command out. If it was polysynaptic, there was another interneuron right here that was bifurcating, synapsing with a motor neuron, and also going up to the brain after crossing over. So this is an example of the polysynaptic. This is an example of monosynaptic. This is showing you the patellar reflex. So when they tap on your knee and your knee moves. So they tap on your knee taking a hammer, and that's going to cause stretching of spindle muscle fibers. And that increases the sensory neuron activity that's going to take the sensory information here. And your spinal cord is going to process the information. It's going to send a motor command that's going to cause the knee to move. So the response is going to produce a reflexive kick. So your knee's going to kick back. In order for you to tell the type of touch it is if it's a hammer or someone tapping your knee with their hand, your brain has to process that information. So there would be another interneuron that's crossing over, going to the brain for you to know what type of touch it was. And if there is an injury on the spinal cord and the information cannot travel up to the brain, there's still this reflex occurring. So your knee is still going to move, but you won't be able to tell that it was touched. You won't be able to tell that there was a tap on your knee. So on this picture, what you have the steps written down for the sensory and the motor neurons. I went over this picture, but if you need the steps written down, then you can copy those from here. So just to give you an overview of what we did today, we have the information coming in from the back and also from the front of the body. It's sensory information. It's going to go through the dorsal root, and it's going to go into the dorsal gray horn. And then the sympathetic nervous system is part of your autonomic nervous system. So sensory information from the visceral organs. So let's say your heart is also going to travel through the information that needs to go in the spinal cord, travel through the dorsal root. And then you have the ventral ramus and the dorsal ramus. Ventral means it's going to take the information from the front of the body, and this is going to take the information from the back of the body, and it's going to go through the dorsal root to the dorsal gray horn. Once the information is in here, it can synapse on another interneuron. Information can cross over, decussate, go up to the brain. And it can also go synapse with another motor neuron that's going to send the command out. Let's look at that. So you have a few steps here. So here, ventral root is taking the commands out. You have 2 of them there. You have the visceral motor and semantic motor going out. And then you again have the dorsal and ventral ramus. So the dorsal ramus is going to take the commands out to the skin and the skeletal muscles. That's going to take the information towards the back. From the ventral ramus is going to take the information to the front, so the muscles of the body, wall, limbs, and this is towards the back. Now you have another part coming off of here. Again, this is part of your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So you have rami here. You have white ramus that's going to have myelinated neurons. And you have gray ramus that's going to contain cell bodies. Sympathetic ganglion. Ganglion is anytime you have a cell body that's outside of CNS. So this is called sympathetic ganglion. Sympathetic is part of your autonomic nervous system. And if you follow this back, it's coming from the lateral gray horn. So it's coming from the lateral part of the gray horn, lateral part of the gray matter. So some of the disorders that can happen if there's an injury to the spinal cord, one of them is brachial plexus birth palsy. That happens when there's nerve trauma during difficult deliveries. So when they're trying to quickly deliver baby shoulders after the head is delivered, it can stretch the head away from the shoulder, and that can tear some of the ventral rami where the commands are going out, or some of the nerve roots of the brachial plexus. That can cause a loss of sensation and motion in the shoulder, but the forearm and the hand still function. And sometimes when you're sitting for a long time, your foot falls asleep, or if there's a lot of pressure on your hand can fall asleep. Those are called pressure palsies. And depending on, let's say you are putting pressure on the radial side or the radial nerve, that can result in the wrist drop and difficulty lifting the wrist. And then there's carpal tunnel syndrome. That can happen if you're typing for a really, really long time, if it's part of your work. And that's when it starts to put pressure on the nerves that are going through the carpal tunnel. Sometimes you hit your ulnar nerve when you hit your elbow, and that's called the funny bone. So when you bump the medial side of your elbow, you can experience temporary ulnar nerve palsy, and that causes dysfunction of your ulnar nerve, and that's also known as hitting your funny bone. And then last one we have is this really famous one known as sciatica, and that's when the lumbar disc exerts pressure on the lumbar sacral nerves in the cauda equina. So that's known as sciatica. It can cause pain in the area, and sometimes it's difficult to find the exact location or the disc pressure. Another thing I wanted to mention is the spinal tap or the lumbar puncture. When they collect the cerebrospinal fluid to test for a disease, or when they want to put anesthesia they're going to insert the needle between the L3 and L4, or L4 and L5. And the reason, if you remember, we said the spinal cord is going to end at L1. There's also spinal nerves that are going down there, but when you put the needle there, those nerve roots can roll out of the way, and then you can collect fluid from there to test for any infection. And they can also put anesthesia there when they want to block the sensory and motor functions. In your lower limbs, they can put anesthesia in that area. That's going to temporarily block the sensory and motor activity. That's all I have for the spinal cord. Next chapter is going to cover the brain.